Good evening. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Birgit Meyer this evening. She has come just from a conference in Prague, and on her way to northern Germany, she stops in Erlangen to give us a lecture today. One of her first books was titled Translating the Devil. And I have the impression somehow you take it up again today, translating the spirits. Fortunately, it's not the devil today. It's only spirits. Professor Meyer she's a professor of religious studies at the University of Utrecht, and she is a trained cultural anthropologist, and that means she studies religion also from a perspective which focuses on the material aspects, but also, and this is how I get to know you first, on the post-colonial perspective. Birgit Meyer is combining a field of research and theoretical reflection in a kind of, you can say, multidisciplinary framework. One of her central concerns of her research is to gain a better understanding of how manifestations of religions are changing in time, how they are influenced by encounters, by entanglements. And her academic work focuses on mission and colonialism. That is the other field where I got to know you, because I'm also doing research on mission history. But she is focusing mainly on, or has been focusing mainly on Africa, and here especially on Ghana. Some of the topics that she's dealing with is the question of how conversion takes place, or how conversion can be interpreted in modernity. What is the role of the rise of Pentecostal churches in neoliberal contexts? And what is the relationship also then between media, religion, and the let's say, process of identity building? One aspect which she also will talk about today is the creation of cultural heritage and the role of material religion, and the public role of religion in Europe as well as in Africa. So her research, which she has done in Ghana, is embedded in her interest in conceptual questions related to diverse manifestations of religion in the past as well as in the present, and the coexistence of people of different religions, of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, and of course the impact of colonialism on the entanglement between people in Africa and in Europe. So we can say her work is characterized by an examination of the physical, material, politic, aesthetic dimensions of religion, and all this from an anthropological perspective. And Professor Meyer has developed this research interest, which I just tried to sketch now, in various research programs and research projects funded with millions of euros in the past years. And one of the programs which she has been a PI in the last years is Religious Matters in an Entangled World. And she has leading this project since 2017. And Birgit Meyer, we are looking forward to your lecture today and to our discussions. Welcome, Birgit.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to come here and give a lecture in your seminar series. I'm also really very pleased to meet so many people I have known for long, and where I even didn't realize that they would all be here. So this is really exciting and really very nice for me. I also want to say that I find the theme of your Kollegforschergruppe very appealing. while I have never employed the concept of esoteric practices proposed by you, reading your statement, I see many resonances between your project and my own work. For like you, I seek to eschew what you call an imperialism of categories and struggle to find a language to talk about my work. And hence, we must notice the relevance of translation, which also forms the central theme in my research. And it's indeed a kind of thread coming up sometimes more strongly than at other moments. And this is also what will occupy me in this lecture. And so, what are the artifacts that this image depicts? And apparently, of course, there is no lack of words to answer these questions, but I also guess that you might be hesitant to use terms as fetish, I use these in question marks, charm or amulet. These terms are at hand to name what we see here, and they all relate, I think, to a larger category of Zauberei, Zaubermittel, or magic. At the same time, the awareness that these terms are rooted in a resilient colonial lexicon may make us vary to use any word at all. So how then might we speak about the artifacts depicted here in a blue box in the Übersee-Museum Bremen, which are called dzokawo in the language of the initial Ewe-speaking users? The gap between dzokawo and these other terms signals the pitfalls and also trickiness of translation, calling for caution and skills in drawing connections between the original meanings and those imposed on the objects through translation into other languages and discourses. This lecture takes this gap as a starting point and is situated against the horizon of debates about the need to deconstruct the epistemological ethnocentrism and what you call imperialism of categories that still haunts research in anthropology and religious studies. The first and foremost task is to conduct a critical inquiry into categories from the colonial lexicon that have functioned as an epistemic framework to represent people such as the Ewe in West Africa as heathen or idolatric in missionary discourse, and as exponents of an early stage in the evolution of culture and religion in anthropological discourse. The German term Zaubermittel, which I would translate as means to do magic, was employed in both discourses. And this lecture addresses the problems resulting from this colonial missionary and scholarly translation and categorization, and raises questions about the limits, but also possibilities of translation conducted otherwise. And this lecture has three parts. Firstly, I will explain how the dzokawo you just saw became part of a missionary collection kept in what is now called the Übersee-Museum in Bremen since around 1900. Second, I will introduce the work of the multidisciplinary transregional legbawo project that studies the provenance of this collection and reflects about its possible futures. And thirdly, I will delve into the tricky question of translation, addressing also the issue of spirit. So now the collection piece. What I call the collection piece, and others also have come to call it like that, includes about 550 artifacts taken from the Ewe-speaking area in what is now southeastern Ghana and Togo, in which the Norddeutsche Missionsgesellschaft was active since the mid-19th century and flourished during the period of German colonialism between 1884 and 1914, as you know. They have been kept in the Übersee-Museum Bremen for more than 120 years. And as you may know, and Andreas Nering referred to that, the work of the NMG, so I will just use NMG, Norddeutsche Missionsgesellschaft, from now on, among the Ewe has occupied me for long. It was the focus of my PhD research back in the early 1990s. I studied the process of translation, which involved missionary work on standardizing the Ewe language, a process understood by them as uplifting it by turning it into writing so as to make it fit for conveying the gospel. In so doing, the mission, together with Ewe translators, coined a Christian discourse. On the one hand, this discourse established equivalences between Ewe and German terms, thereby evoking a sense of analogy and even equality. On the other hand, translation was predicated on a radical binary of God versus the devil. The latter became the master above all sorts of deities and spirits, now framed as Christian demons. Translation meant the fixation of Ewe terms in Christian discourse, but also implied instability, that is, the possibility of meanings to go astray, risking that terms fixed might mean other things in the process of translation from German to Ewe and vice versa. For example, among Ewe speakers, Mawu was known as a god that was very, very far away. But now it became the term for the Christian God Almighty, who was said to be very close. For their needs, people hitherto dealt with Trovo or Vaudin, two terms for deities, one used more in the northern part of Eweland, the other in the south. But now people were expected to relate to Mawu via Jesus. Calling on Jesus was to replace the calling of the Trovo, who were rejected as demons. Jesus was analogous to them in the structural sense, but at the same time claimed to be totally different. In the figure of Jesus, analogy to and fundamental contrast with Trovo came together. The difference between Jesus and the Trovo was haunted by their analogy. In my earlier work, I tried to show how missionization triggered multiple responses from Ewe people, with some converting, developing an Africanized version of Christianity, and possibly also backsliding, while others remained unconvinced and resisted. Preaching against what they construed as heathendom, and I do this, I mean quotation marks, right? The NMG missionaries demonized Ewe deities and spirits and required from converts to break all their ties with them. Concretely, this implied an interdiction to attend ceremonies and rituals and the rejection of all material forms related to Ewe spirituality. They were burnt. It was only relatively recently that I returned to the activities of the NMG among the Ewe. While before I had mainly focused on discourse and ritual practice, now I looked at conversion from a material perspective on religion, understood as a practice of mediation through which entities held to be unseen are rendered tangible through material forms. I now started to think concretely about the whereabouts of the heathen materials seized by the mission, especially the personal items. What happened to them? As I found out, some were sent to Germany to demonstrate and also research the use of Zauberei, Zaubermittel, magic, I would say, among the Ewe. For the mission, the use of magic signified a state of idolatry, Götzendienst, to be overcome by conversion. The first chair of Protestant missiology, Gustav Warnecht, asserted that converts were expected to show a resolute earnestness to break with heathendom and all its customs, particularly with all magic, and to separate oneself from all idolatrous objects, including idols, amulets, magic, potions, and so on. And I don't read the rest of the quote, but I think you can glance at it. And this statement very much informed the work of missionaries, Protestant missionaries in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. And also you see, in a way, this implemented in the work of the NMG. For the anthropology at the time, Zauberei and the use of Zaubermittel were taken to indicate a certain stage in the evolution of magic, which Westerners were said to have surpassed. And the missions were not very happy with this analysis because they were against the idea of evolution and rather claimed a kind of an original monotheism, an idea that has been very much profiled by Wilhelm Schulz, as you all know, I think. The Protestant missionary from the NMG, Karl Spies, showed a great interest to provide the Städtisches Museum für Natur, Völker und Handelskunde that had been founded in 1896 in his hometown Bremen with artifacts. And Heinrich Schurz, very well known for his work on money, so some of you may know that, and on Männerbünde. He worked at that museum as an ethnologist, and he had a special interest in Zaubermittel, Mittel, and he asked Spies to pay special attention to artifacts in that category. And he assumed, as he writes here in the introduction of an article in which he analyzes part of the Spies collection, he assumed that Spies would be able to get such Zaubermittel through new converts. And of the 550 items sent to the museum by Spies, about 300, and these you see here, are related to ever spiritual practice. Spies was prepared and eager to not only preach the gospel to the Ewe and make them turn away from the worship of idols, but he also wanted to contribute to ethnographic knowledge about the Ewe people through collecting and publications. Part of the collection are well documented through Spies' extensive diaries and articles, both in mission and secular scholarly venues. And a small part of the collection was exhibited in a display case until World War II, when the museum evacuated its collection to a safe place, rightly so, because the museum was bombed and to a large extent destroyed and rebuilt later. After its return to the museum, the collection was kept in the depot, where it gained the interest of museum curator and anthropologist Silke Seibold. She also made a very interesting showcase about the link between the NMG and the collection history of the museum. All items collected by Spies, you just see a sample here, an example, have been listed, photographed, labeled, and at times relabeled in the digital museum catalog. This offers a partial yet telling view of how the artifacts were registered and kept over the past 120 years. In January 2020, I took some pictures of legba figures and an article by Spies, which features dzokawo to Ghana. And I discussed the materials with the voodoo priest, that is the term he takes for himself, Christopher Vonkujovi, from the African Magic Temple in Accra, to whom I was introduced by my then still PhD student, now doctor, Angel Antonio Grossi. So far, Vonkujovi had not known that these kinds of artifacts were kept in Bremen, though he was, of course, aware of the process of missionary iconoclasm in the course of converting Ewe people to Christianity. This had also occurred in his own family in the northern part of the Volta region, and at some point in time, through his encounter with Hindu deities in India and with Shinto in Japan, Vonkujovi had decided to reappreciate indigenous powers from his own people, rather than remain stuck in the Christian mindset that demonizes these powers up until today. And he opened a shrine in Ghana's capital, Accra, and addresses a large group of clients via social media among people of African descent in the US and in Europe. For Vonkujovi, the items in the collection were not just dead objects, but living entities. He found that the spirits had taken me as their messenger and that it was time to find out more about their trajectory and current state. Our conversation made me realize that the artifacts were situated at the crossroads of entirely different power knowledge systems, which I would like to distinguish as the logic of the museum and that of the shrine. The items in the collection were objects preserved and handled according to museum protocols, kept at a cool and dry place, protected from rotting by the use of pesticides, and to be touched with gloves only. But for the priest, they were vessels of, as he put it, living spirits that were hungry and hence would have to be fed and interrogated. The presentation of the photographs and copies of Spies' article to scholars in Ghana and Togo then also raised their keen interest. And this brings me to the Legba Joka project. In September 2022, so about 2.5 years after I had presented some images to Vonkujovi, we were in a way halted by the pandemic, of course. But then in September 2020, together with researchers from Ghana, Togo, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as with Christopher Vonkujovi and his son, the Afa diviner Kofi Vonkujovi, we set up the Legba Joka project and met in the Übersee-Museum Bremen for 1 week. Its main concern is to explore the provenance of the Spies collection so as to develop a fresh decolonial take on the nature of dzokawo in the past and in the present. Our team, you see it here, gathered around the items for more than 2 weeks in April 2024, exploring them through material analysis, studying their labels and written historical descriptions, and also conducting spiritual research undertaken by the two priests who generously shared their knowledge about present-day dzokawo from their practices at home. And I think this is a really telling and interesting picture. Here we just go through TMS, how all the collection Spies has been registered, and make a kind of selection between artifacts somehow related to spiritual practice and others. He also collected wood and so on. Also interesting to look at, but we simply could not do all. And here you see Kofi Ronkujobi hold up his own stick used for the Afa divination when this stick is being shown. So it was very, very interesting to engage in this project. Jo, meaning fire, also in the sense of a force or energy, and Fa, meaning string in the Ewe language, the term dzokawo would pluralize, indicates an intriguing combination of visible and hidden elements. Dzokawo could be described as bundles that assemble various natural and artificial elements, tied together by knotted strings made from plant fibers. These elements include sticks, cowrie shells, gourds, pouches, and nodes containing power. Powder inside is the dzoka's power. The historical sources and current narrations by the priests revealed strong similarities and continuities, as well as a break with the past in which dzokawo were still employed as everyday remedies. Most importantly, our collaborative research revealed a marked difference between the ways of understanding, handling, and using dzokawo in shrines, past and contemporary, and in the museum. While in the latter, the dzokawo are objects to be stored and preserved, in the former they are inhabited by spirits that are hungry and need to be fed. As a scholar from Germany with extensive research experience with regard to conversion to Christianity and the operation of the NMG in the Ewe-speaking area, I found it really amazing to witness how the face-to-face encounter with these dzokawo and related artifacts triggered deep questions about their value and meaning and use prior to the arrival of the NMG. This opened up a window to the pre-colonial, pre-Christian Ewe world, which was indeed also suffering, of course, all kinds of wars with European powers involved in it, trade in enslaved people, and all that. In Ghana, matters relating to dzokawo and related material forms were effectively despised as idolatry from a Christian perspective and largely ousted from the public domain. Paradoxically, this colonial collection now makes it possible to reconsider and rewrite the hierarchical encounters between Ewe spiritual practices and Protestant Christianity from an alternative angle. Having a close look at the artifacts allowed us to explore intriguing assemblages of multiple ingredients through binding and knotting, including interior places hidden from view that contain powder, which is power, as we know from Martin Holbrook and others, and to reconstruct how 19th century users had employed them. Working with this collection and taking pictures and clips all the time, we ascribe prime importance to our multiple perspectives and positions across the secular, religious, spiritual boundary. Alas, the indigenous epistemologies of which the artifacts were part in the past were barely documented due to their excessive framing as idolatry and fetishism, which was used as an equivalent way into the 19th century. So while Pietz has a point in saying fetishism with the bros came to mean something else, in missionary discourse, fetishism and idolatry were used interchangeably. The imposition of Eurocentric and Christian epistemological frameworks marginalized indigenous Ewe ways of knowing and acting. And this is what we try to redress by situating the collection in an in-between space that involves both Ewe and missionaries. And some voices in this space have been silenced and almost effaced, and we now try to learn about them rather than regarding the museum as the only and dominant space in which the collection has meaning and value. Face to face with the collection in the museum, our team has looked closely at all the artifacts, read their descriptions in Spies 4 diaries and scholarly articles, and listened to the information generously offered by Christopher Wonkujowi, who compared the collection to artifacts he himself works with in his shrine. Aware of the differences between the museum logic and the shrine logic with regard to the legbawo and dzokawo, we also found intriguing possibilities for overlap. For in certain respects, both logics folded more smoothly into each other than one might have anticipated. Prior to every working session, Wonkujowi poured libation, this is here, to the spirits dwelling in the artifacts, asking them to pardon our human ignorance about their nature and their previous makers and owners. While the museum would normally not allow, of course, not allow liquids to come close to the artifacts, a pragmatic solution was found by the curator Silke Seibold to make libation possible. In the first visit in 2022, by simply using a chamber plant, and later by making available sterilized earth in a plastic container. And this is what you see here. This gesture acknowledges the coexistence of perspectives and logics about the nature and needs of the artifacts that have long been objects for the museum, yet were spirits or entities and energies for Wonkujowi. Of course, it is a gesture in the hegemonic secular space of the museum, offering a temporary hospitality to entities and energies that are neglected in the normal course of things in the museum. In our discussion, language became a crucial issue. How to talk about the collection? I mean, just doing it in Ewe was not really an option. Also, I have basic knowledge of Ewe, but not on that high level. And there were other researchers too who would not speak Ewe. So we had to find a language. And of course, this was, we would converse in English. The question was how to make sure that a Eurocentric Christian or colonial scholarly epistemology is not reproduced, and rather to open up to something unknown, as one of our team members, the researcher, ethnographer, filmmaker, artist Sela Ajay puts it. So we seek to unlearn and avoid the term object, and we use artifact or at times item as a grantedly imperfect middle ground. Overall, we stick to the specific Ewe terms, which is also reflected in the name of our research group, Legba Group. Of course, this does not save us from the need to engage in translating, for which we rely also on the trained Germanist, Koku Azamede, and the Ewe linguist, Mercy Kluger, so as to open up multiple perspectives. We combine various methods from historical analysis of textual sources to thorough material analysis of the specific artifacts. So our team member, Kochogavua, who is a well-known archaeologist at the University of Ghana, also engaged in measuring, doing all what archaeologists do, as it were, then to linguistic analysis of the meanings of Ewe terms and the impossibility and possibility of their translation to English and German, to what we call spiritual analysis through the use of the Afa. Afa is a complex divination system with 256 codes, the combination of which is tied to proverbs, poems, legends, and songs. It mobilizes stored knowledge vis-à-vis the artifacts interrogated by us. Its use as a methodological tool is important to find alternative meanings apart from those reported by Spies, whose missionary perspective is still overwriting them. Decentering and decolonizing knowledge obviously means to open up multiple epistemologies. I found it incredibly insightful to learn from our exchanges, through which it is possible to get at least a glimpse of the so far silenced indigenous Ewe position. It pushes fieldwork to another level of exchange in a new research partnership. Prompted by this material analysis and the consultations of historical sources, I came to see dzokawo as a an ordinary, not spectacular as it always was for the missionary perspective, an ordinary part of everyday life in every society that was still shaken by the aftermath of the slave trade and the onset of colonialism. People living at the time endured an existential insecurity, which was mitigated by various types of dzokawo, tailored to offer protection against theft, heal sickness, ensure success in war and hunting, improve one's business, and ward off evil forces. The dzokawo assembled by Spies can be taken as a catalogue of sorrows, anxieties, and aspirations of their previous users. They also indicate the creativity and experimentation of their makers, weaving together elements indigenous to every society, as well as items imported through trade with Europeans for a lot of textures, materials, threads, and so on that came through import. So it's a very living practice. We did not leave it at historical research in the museum, but also took pictures of the collection from TMS, the system you showed, and the things we had photographed, to Ghana and Togo. Our Ghanaian and Togolese team members present pictures of the artifacts in the collection to traditional priests in the Volta region and southern Togo, so as to conduct, and the Volta region is in Ghana, so as to conduct oral history and to elicit responses about the possible pasts and also futures of the collection. And I was able to witness part of this research, which I find highly instructive, as it shows that dzokawo and related items from the sphere of ever traditional or indigenous religious practice are still a prime matter of concern. On the one hand, there is a strong Christian, especially Pentecostal presence that continues to condemn the dzokawo as the dangerous idolatry in the well-trodden manner. So this is the bus of the EP Church in Anyaku, in the area where also the shrines were located. On the other hand, there is a growing interest on the part of artists and youth to know more about this whole phenomenon, and an assertion by every priest that their practice is alive and kicking, and that they also have many, many Christian clients who come for it in secret. The specter of idolatry and fetishism is, however, still haunting the dzokawo and other artifacts classified as idolatry, fetishism, magic, and a need to be deconstructed. It does not only pertain to the artifacts themselves, but also to their historical and current makers and users. Clearly, these terms take part in the constitution of their makers and users as heathens, who, as shown by Ohiniko Tofa, according to Christian discourse, could only be made human through Christian conversion. This also implies that working through problematic translations is a prime concern of this project, so as to develop ways to reconceptualize their position in an African spirituality. This reconceptualization is part of the future of the collection, next to the possibility of the material restitution of certain artifacts. At stake is a fundamental reevaluation of something that has been endowed with fear from a Christian perspective that is still omnipresent in public space. So as Kochugavua put it poignantly, the fear of Joka is the fear of ourselves. And I come to the third part, translation. So in this last part of my lecture, I will address the question of translation, the transmission of terms across linguistic boundaries, which always involves power, as becomes very clear with regard to missionary and scholarly frames in which dzokawo and related items were translated and re-signified into the colonial lexicon. I showed how the use of the term Zaubermittel transposed dzokawo to the sphere of a deplorable superstition on the part of the mission, as well as into a low animistic stage of the evolution of religion on the part of colonial anthropology, as argued by Schurz. For Schurz, as well as for many anthropologists of his time, Zauberei was rooted in a naive animist worldview that ascribed human emotions to the uncanny and diffuse beings that brought sickness, mishap, and death. He saw animism as the root of religion, and magic as the means to achieve protection through amulets, and at the next evolutionary stage, to launch attacks against evil. The main effect of employing magic was the strengthening of the will and the genesis of hope through psychological self-manipulation, according to Schwartz. In both cases, dzokawo epitomized a backward stage that was to be transcended, be it through conversion to Christianity or evolution towards a higher level, enforced by the civilizing mission that was called upon to legitimate colonization. In this way, dzokawo became a particular instance next to many others referred to with different terms within the general, presumably universal, but de facto Eurocentric category of Zauberei magic. Drawn into missionary and evolutionary discourse, magic became a marker of backwardness that was contrasted with Protestant faith, posited as the highest form of religion, and with a rational outlook epitomized in modernity. In other words, translated as means to do magic, Zaubermittel, dzokawo were assigned a place in the highly normative, theologically inflected magic, religion, science triad. In this triad, as shown by Wouter Hanegraaff, magic was made to contain those ideas and practices that were ousted from what was regarded as true religion and true science. While the category of magic had long served to contain practices dismissed as superstition, in the aftermath of imperial European outreach, it became part of a colonial script that took phenomena such as dzokawo as evidence of superstition and animism. So in sum, the translation and categorization of dzokawo as Zaubermittel hijacks them into a dismissive colonial hegemony. Through the translation of dzokawo as magic, these artifacts and their users were appropriated and objectified into a colonial missionary and scholarly discourse, becoming signifiers of the primitive. And here I'm much inspired also by the work of Roger Sansi and Irashima Duli on translation as objectification. Given this highly problematic use of the category of magic in colonial knowledge productions, there are good reasons to deconstruct and reject it as an utterly unsuitable translation. Still, we may wonder, perhaps, whether it might be possible to liberate magic from being the doomed other of Christianity, religion, and rationality, and the marker of primitive otherness for the colonized in the mission fields in the global South. After all, magic often also serves to counter the hegemonic claims in the name of allegedly true religion and true science, pointing at cracks and weaknesses in dominant narratives of modernity as rational and civilized, as Peter Pels and I suggested quite some time ago in our volume, Magic and Modernity. I cannot go further into this question here, but just want to state that in any case, retaining magic as a critical term would require that translation of local terms into the category of magic would be conducted in a non-hegemonic manner and out of the box of already fixed imperial categories so as to question established meanings. The broader point here is the colonial lexicon persists in the ways in which we talk about missionary and other collections. And the question is how to become aware of this and move beyond it. Should we declare that translations are impossible and cannot but misrepresent non-Western artifacts and the ideas and practices tied to them? Should we stress the incompatibility of entirely different knowledge systems, each with their own ontologies? Or could we take the entanglement of people and things in highly unequal power relations and the translations that ensue from this as a starting point for further critical analysis? And you can imagine, as a scholar from the Netherlands and Germany devoted to unpack the repercussions of colonialism in the here and now, I do opt for the latter. And this, in fact, also underpins my work in the Legba project. While I certainly acknowledge the symbolic violence of translation undertaken from the colonial lexicon, I think that translations and their ongoing critique are necessary to be able to talk across different worlds, which I see as the main task, attraction of anthropology, and also a huge challenge. So the question is not whether, but how to translate across languages. This involves acknowledging on a certain level the impossibility of translation and the existence of untranslatables, as Barbara Cassens puts it, and still doing it from a pragmatic and critical angle, inserting ourselves into long-standing networks of terms that have been rendered as equivalent, while tracking remaining differences and incommensurabilities. This is not just a matter of pairing a term to be translated with an equivalent term in the target language, but of knowing how this pair of terms is situated in broader philosophical and epistemological frames. Cassens' impressive lexicon of untranslatables only refers to Europe, and the lemmas on issues as God, mind, soul, and spirit already reveal huge differences across philosophical thought from antiquity to the post-Enlightenment, and between German, French, English, Italian, Greek, and Hebrew, and Basque, I think she also included that. Clearly, the assumed stability of the meanings of such terms across translation is challenged once we become aware of their meanings in these separate languages at certain moments in time. Translation always carries something from one language to the other that sticks, in the sense that words assemble a variety of meanings. I much appreciate Cassens' lexicon for showcasing the complexities of West European philosophical thought. But for me, of course, the whole problem of translation is even more complex, as I'm thinking about the possibility and impossibility of translation in a colonial, missionary, and post-colonial and post-missionary context. And here I find the book Von Sprache zu Sprache. I'm not sure it has been translated into English by now. The German translation was earlier, by the philosopher Bachir Diagne, to be of great interest. Diagne proposes a practice of translation understood as transmission along a horizontal rather than vertical axis, wherein the target language lends hospitality to the source language. Thus, translation is the coming together of at least two languages and worlds of thinking. So indeed, translation is dialogue, just as dialogue is translation. This raises the question how to make sure that all participants are prepared to host and be hosted by others in speaking about the artifacts in missionary collections. Diagne expands the idea of translation to artifacts kept in European museums that have been framed through colonial violence as fetishes. And I think that this can be expanded to artifacts as dzokawo. He proposes to undertake a precise reading of the translations into which these artifacts have been forced, so as to act as mediators of Western and Christian perspectives, and how they have been remediated subsequently by multiple actors, including artists and curators up to our time. Studying translations involves both bemoaning the gap between the meaning in the original and the target language, and finding possibilities to expand one's horizon through lending hospitality to the foreign through translation. And that is what we are doing in our Legba project. While it is conducive to bring across the multiple meanings and values of the dzokawo, this is not, I can tell you, a very smooth process. For many of our team members, it was at times utterly painful to work through the colonial, missionary, and scholarly ascriptions, exactly because they are still around today and imply a negative view of non-Christian Africans. On my part, at times, I felt driven out of my comfort zone, especially regarding the issue of spirit. Von Kujovi's often reiterated statement that the artifacts contain or even are living, hungry spirits has shaken me, especially as I realized that taking them as such would mean another way of dealing with them on the long run, totally incompatible with the museum logic and challenging in many, many ways, given that spirits may also be very demanding and potentially dangerous to interact with. As said, we tried to make as much as possible use of Ewe terms, but the English term spirit to translate the animatedness of dzokawo and similar artifacts came up many times. Ironically, as a materialist, I have long called, theoretically we could say, for acknowledging the agency of objects vis-à-vis humans in all sorts of assemblages. And yes, I agree. with, for example, Paul Basu, who points at the in-betweenness of things as mediators between the here and now and another world. And yet, as I am not into voodoo, nor into Christianity anymore at least, I'm not sure how much room to give in my own thinking to the logic of the shrine, according to which legbawo and dzokawo are alive. I've been trained to research about beliefs in spirits, but not with them. Studying religion, I can recur to a stance of methodological agnosticism or Ludism. But I'm still pondering about how to translate spirits. After all, an English translation already into the epistemological frame I'm trying to expand and decolonize. What on earth is a spirit? How to situate the translation of dzokawo as spirit, which comes down to a translation of something specific, into an alternative general category. What do we mean by spirit here? Cassin's lexicon already presents so many different meanings of spirit, esprit, Geist, Geest in various languages and philosophical traditions, showing that it is placed in various configurations alongside soul, mind, and wit in English, and also harking back to Latin mens, anima, to the Greek psyche, and Hebrew ruach and neshama. A whole study field by its own, detailing networks of terms and conventions of translations arising in the midst of something untranslatable, and showing also how metaphysical meanings were carried across the threshold of modernity. The English term spirit is clearly polysemantic, raising the question what we mean by spirit. I'm posing there even more urgently. And the Ewe term bogbo, which is usually translated as spirit, but not really used to mean spirit in the sense as we talk about here, might not fully match the English term spirit, let alone the German term Geist or the Dutch Geest. I think the two Geest and Geist are very close. Gradually, I have come to realize that my unease with the term has to do with the way spirit features in a particular scholarly discourse in which spirits are claimed to be ontological realities and in which animism is profiled as a broad category, so as new animism. Spirits are framed as ontological beings, and while I'm not against exploring ontologies as such, I see this as crossing a threshold into another world. I wonder how to translate across the threshold when returning from it. I'm very hesitant to translate invisible beings in that other world back as spirits with a true existence and reality. For me, this is still a somehow religionist choice, and as part of a critique of secular modernity that takes spirits seriously in their own right. And I think this comes with certain problems. And perhaps this is a huge topic. I just bring in a recent example. So just last week, I attended a very interesting roundtable discussion at the European Centers of African Studies Conference, ECAS, in Prague. And the roundtable session was titled, Taking Spirits Seriously. The question was how to do so, and one option is indeed to adopt a scholarly position that acknowledges the entities in indigenous worlds that are translated as spirits, as real and true, thereby crossing the border governed by methodological agnosticism or atheism and affirming their reality. I find this difficult because I do not see how I, as a scholar, would be able to make such truth claims. I do not reject people's claims about what we might translate as spirits and gods and God, but I cannot endorse them, only accept the claims respectfully from a distance. Acknowledging what is translated as spirits in indigenous languages and cultures as real often goes along with the idea, and that is what the discussion also showed, of a new animism, understood as a broad term that revalues indigenous worlds long overrun and despised by the onslaught of imperial expansion, including Christian missions and modern thought. And I share the view that it is necessary to criticize that onslaught and the mistranslations that occurred in its slipstream. But I'm hesitant to embrace new animism as a frame to characterize indigenous cultures. I fear that doing so might trap these cultures once again in an othering and potentially exoticizing frame that defines this otherness through the reality of spirits and hence ultimately through a religious or almost theological repertoire. Why recur, I wonder, and I'm a scholar in religious studies, right? But why recur to the discursive frame of religion at all, which after all was imported to Africa and to the global South as an initially foreign concept, albeit with increasing success? Are the spirits that inhabit the legbawo and dzokawo part of an indigenous religion and thus a matter of belief in spiritual beings to invoke Tyler and their worship? Or should we cast our efforts in translation much broader and be more critical about the category of religion that had a big role in colonial governance, helping to distinguish good and bad religion, and think against it? And perhaps as an aside, a colleague of Spies, Jakob Spies, wrote a big book, Ever Religion, and it brought in a way the term and described ever spiritual practices as religion. And it's very, very worthwhile as a source, but it's also a very modern frame imposed, I would say. Here it is important to bring in that Christopher von Kujovi consistently rejected the framing of dzokawo as religion, let alone bad religion, and by implication as a matter of belief. He said that many times. We don't worship dzokawo, we don't believe in them. He insisted that they are human-made artifacts that assemble entities and energies from the realm of nature and must be activated to become effective. He talked about the world as being in vibration and about the making and use of dzokawo as tapping into energies of animals, plants, and other substances for the sake of protection. In his understanding, energies are entities or spirits, albeit not in the usual religious sense. And this became clear to me just pondering our conversations. And I think this should caution us against trapping the term spirit in a religious frame. Perhaps his use of spirits might come closest to the Hebrew term ruach, wind. Following this trail, spirit would refer to a force, or perhaps even a life force, that has power to set things in motion, like energy. In von Kujovi's understanding, energies as such are universal, which he also often said, but they are given different names, he said, such as joka among the Ewe. Putting different materials together, dzokawo connect and concentrate energies. Von Kujovi also likened the powder and power in the interior of the joka, which you saw, to a SIM card, able to tune in with different energies to achieve certain ends. This take on joka as an assemblage of material elements tied together through knots, with the knot itself acting as a condensation of force, is refreshing in my understanding. And I must say I'm indebted to your colleagues in Hamburg, the Forschergruppe Imaginarien der Kraft, where I also went with my project and thought through issues of genealogies of power, force, energy, and so on. And so I find this thinking about dzokawo as from the angle of force, I find refreshing. For doing so moves us not only beyond the well-trodden discourse on magic as antipode to Christianity and science, but also does not trap us in a discourse of new animism. At stake is a new focus on practices of dealing with forces and energies. So in sum, our exploration of dzokawo reveals that they may be well understood as an assemblage of forces to generate certain desired effects, which is grounded in an indigenous cosmology based on meticulous observation and very, very skillful combination. Placed in a colonial field of forces, dzokawo were targeted for destruction by mobilizing the gospel as a divine force to eradicate superstition. In this way, dzokawo and magic became associated in a negative manner. The collection at the Übersee-Museum Bremen, once set up to document means to do magic as evidence of idolatry and animism in a world targeted for extinction, now invites us to think beyond the colonial box. And this is exactly what I've tried to do in this lecture, and I hope that I have been able to convey why it could be instructive to deconstruct colonial translations while also engaging in translation afresh so as to be able to think across thresholds and remain able to talk with each other. Yes. Thanks for your attention.